First Lieutenant Creighton Abrams gripped his Sherman's turret rim as his gunner peered through the periscope, scanning the mist-covered terrain ahead. They had been warned about Panthers, the formidable German tanks whose sloped armor had proven nearly impervious to standard American shells. What Abrams and his crew didn't know was that tucked into their ammunition rack were 6 rounds that would rewrite the tactical calculus of armored warfare. 6 M93 high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds, each containing a tungsten carbide core capable of transforming their medium Sherman into what German tankers would come to fear as an unexpected threat. The psychological impact of this ammunition would prove as devastating as its penetrating power, shattering German assumptions about American tank capabilities and forcing a complete reassessment of Panther invulnerability. The story of how a specialized ammunition type altered the balance of armored warfare begins not on the battlefields of France, but in the testing grounds and industrial facilities of the United States, where metallurgists and ballistics engineers worked against time to solve a problem that threatened to undermine American armored operations in Europe. The crisis, when German armor became impenetrable. In early 1944, the United States Army faced a dilemma that military planners had failed to anticipate. The M4 Sherman tank, backbone of American armored divisions, was encountering German tanks it could not reliably defeat from the front. The Panther, Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with an 80mm glossus plate sloped at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of approximately 140 millimeters that proved nearly impenetrable to American tank guns. American intelligence had catastrophically underestimated both the quantity and quality of Panthers that would be deployed in France. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, 38% of German tanks in the theater were Panthers. Not the handful predicted by intelligence estimates, but hundreds of these advanced medium tanks, often crewed by inexperienced soldiers but protected by armor that conventional American tank guns simply could not penetrate frontally. The numbers were brutal and undeniable. The 75mm M3 gun that armed most Shermans in Normandy could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical range. The round would simply bounce off the sloped glacis plate with a distinctive metallic clang, leaving the Sherman crew vulnerable to return fire from the Panther's powerful gun, which could destroy a Sherman from over 2,000 meters away. Even the improved 76mm M1 gun, which began reaching units in July 1944, struggled desperately against Panther armor. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped rounds, the 76mm could penetrate 109 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters at 0 degrees obliquity. This was sufficient against the Panzer IV and many German assault guns, but the Panther's sloped frontal armor remained effectively immune. The 76mm could penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet, but only at extremely close range, typically under 100 meters, a distance at which the Panther's advantages in firepower made engagement suicidal for Sherman crews. The problem was not the gun itself, but the ammunition it fired. The kinetic energy delivered by standard armor-piercing ammunition was simply insufficient to defeat the combination of thickness and slope that made the Panther's frontal armor so formidable. The delayed deployment, a catastrophic miscalculation. The deployment of the 76mm gun itself had been a saga of bureaucratic hesitation and belated recognition that would cost American lives. The first M4 Shermans mounting the 76mm M1 gun rolled off production lines in January 1944. These M4 A176 Shermans arrived in Britain on April 10, 1944, with 130 tanks delivered to prepare for the Normandy invasion. Yet despite their availability, American commanders refused to deploy these improved tanks on D-Day. The reasons were multiple and, in hindsight, tragically misguided. Crews lacked adequate training time on the new weapon system. Logistical concerns about maintaining 2 different ammunition types complicated supply planning. Most critically, commanders believed the 75mm gun would prove adequate for the expected opposition. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation rooted in intelligence failures about German armored strength and capabilities. The Panther was not a rare super tank that would appear occasionally. It was standard equipment in panzer divisions, and American tankers would encounter them constantly. By early July 1944, field reports from Normandy painted a grim picture of Sherman inadequacy. On July 2nd, urgent complaints about the 75mm gun's ineffectiveness against German armor reached General Dwight Eisenhower. His response, documented in multiple historical accounts, captured command-level frustration with profanity that has been sanitized in most official records. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" Eisenhower reportedly said, his anger barely controlled. "Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." The full quote, as recorded by witnesses, continued with stronger language expressing his fury that ordnance officers had assured him the 76mm would handle anything the Germans deployed. A board convened on July 12, 1944, determined officially what tank crews already knew from bitter experience. Standard American weapons could not defeat Panthers frontally at combat ranges. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered the 76mm Shermans rushed from Britain to the front lines. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, 102 M4A 176 tanks made their combat debut. The initial engagement reports were sobering. While the 76mm represented a significant improvement over the 75mm, it still struggled against Panther frontal armor at normal combat ranges. Sherman crews quickly learned they needed to maneuver for flank shots or target the Panther's gun mantlet at dangerously close range. Neither option was tactically desirable when facing a tank that could destroy them from 2,000 meters away. American tankers developed various coping strategies, none of them satisfactory. Some units adopted tactics of overwhelming Panthers with numbers, sending 3 or 4 Shermans to engage a single Panther, accepting that 1 or 2 Shermans might be destroyed, but hoping the survivors could achieve killing flank shots. This was brutally effective, but came with predictably high casualty rates. Other units simply avoided engaging Panthers directly, calling for air support, artillery, or tank destroyers whenever German armor was encountered. This tactical timidity surrendered initiative to German forces and allowed Panther crews to dominate the battlefield despite their numerical inferiority. The psychological impact on American tank crews was severe and would shape their approach to armored combat for the remainder of the campaign. Crews nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson lighter, claiming it lit on fire every time, a reference to the Ronson cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." While post-war analysis showed this reputation was exaggerated, Sherman fires were less common than the nickname suggested. The perception shaped behavior and eroded confidence. Tank commanders who spotted Panthers often chose to retreat or call for support rather than engage directly, ceding tactical initiative to an enemy who could be defeated with proper tactics and the right ammunition. The arrival of HVAP rounds would begin changing this calculus, but slowly, hampered by the scarcity of the ammunition and the lack of training on its capabilities and limitations. The solution? Tungsten carbide and physics. The solution to the Panther problem lay in metallurgy and physics rather than larger guns or thicker armor. By July 1944, American ordnance engineers had developed the T4 round, later standardized as the M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition that represented a fundamental departure from conventional armor-piercing design. The principle behind HVAP was elegantly simple. Armor penetration depends on kinetic energy, specifically, the energy concentrated at the point of impact. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. This means that doubling velocity quadruples kinetic energy, while doubling mass only doubles energy. Therefore, increasing projectile velocity is far more effective than increasing mass for improving penetration. But there's a constraint. Increasing muzzle velocity requires either higher propellant charges, which increase barrel wear and chamber pressure to dangerous levels, or reducing projectile weight. Reducing weight while maintaining penetrating power requires using extremely dense materials that concentrate mass into a small penetrator. The M93 HVAP round solved this problem through clever design. The projectile consisted of three main components: a tungsten carbide core, the penetrator, a lightweight aluminum body, the carrier, and a ballistic windshield for aerodynamics. Tungsten carbide is one of the hardest materials available, with a density of 15.6 grams per cubic centimeter, roughly twice the density of steel. This means a tungsten carbide penetrator can be much smaller than a steel penetrator while maintaining the same mass and kinetic energy. The smaller diameter concentrates force on a smaller area, dramatically increasing pressure at the point of impact. The aluminum body served multiple purposes. First, it reduced the overall weight of the projectile while maintaining sufficient diameter to engage the gun's rifling and achieve proper spin stabilization. Second, it provided a sabot, a carrier that separated from the penetrator after leaving the barrel, reducing air resistance and allowing the dense tungsten core to maintain velocity over distance. The ballistic windshield, machined from aluminum, provided aerodynamic efficiency. The design was carefully optimized to minimize drag while the projectile traveled through air, then shatter on impact, allowing the tungsten core to penetrate without interference. The results were dramatic and exceeded even optimistic predictions. The M93 round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second compared to 792 meters per second for the standard M62 round, a 244 meters per second velocity increase that translated directly into devastating penetrating power. At 1,000 yards, approximately 914 meters, the HVAP round could penetrate 160 millimeters of armor at 10 degrees obliquity, according to official War Department testing data. Against the Panther's gun mantlet, with its curved 100 millimeter thick cast steel on early IOSF D and A variants, later increased to 120 millimeter on the IOSF G. This meant reliable penetration at ranges up to 1,000 meters instead of the point-blank distances required by standard ammunition. The mantlets suddenly became a viable target for Sherman crews who had previously been forced to attempt desperate flank attacks or retreat in the face of Panther armor. A Sherman with HVAP could engage Panthers from ranges where the Sherman had reasonable chances of penetrating, while the Panther's return fire, though dangerous, was not automatically fatal. The production problem, tungsten scarcity, but the development of HVAP represented only half the solution. Production was another matter entirely, constrained by material scarcity that would limit HVAP's tactical impact throughout the war. The T4 round depended on tungsten carbide, a strategic material imported primarily from China, which produced 36% of global tungsten supply before the war. Tungsten was critical to numerous war industries: machine tools, essential for manufacturing virtually everything, armor-piercing ammunition for multiple calibers, armor plate hardening, and various industrial processes all competed for limited supplies. American tungsten demand for HVAP ammunition alone consumed hundreds of metric tons annually. Each 76 millimeter HVAP round contained approximately 0.88 kilograms of tungsten carbide, meaning a Sherman carrying 6 rounds required nearly 5.3 kilograms of this scarce strategic material. Multiply this across thousands of Shermans, and the total tungsten requirement became enormous. China produced approximately 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates in 1944, but this had to serve all Allied needs across all applications. The United States supplemented Chinese imports with domestic production from limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but total availability remained severely constrained throughout the war. Germany's tungsten position was far worse, creating a strategic asymmetry that would increasingly favor American forces. German tungsten came primarily from Swedish imports, which declined sharply as the war turned against the Reich, and Sweden became less willing to support the losing side. Domestic German production remained minimal. By 1945, German factories desperately hoarded tungsten for machine tools needed for aircraft engine production, while Panther crews received only standard ammunition despite facing ever-growing numbers of Allied tanks. The United States Ordnance Department had been testing HVAP projectiles since spring 1942, but production at scale did not begin until after the Normandy landings revealed the full extent of the Panther problem. In July 1944, production of 3-inch HVAP rounds for tank destroyers reached 1,000 rounds. August saw 1,000 rounds of 76 mm HVAP produced, barely enough to supply a single armored regiment with minimal loads. September yielded another 1,760 rounds for the 76 mm gun. Not until November 1944 did monthly production reach 5,000 rounds, ramping to 7,000 rounds per month by January 1945. By March 1945, approximately 33,000 rounds of 76 mm HVAP ammunition had been produced, representing a significant industrial effort but still a fraction of what was needed to fully supply American armored forces in Europe. By February 1945, the average 76 mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds, 5 rounds to face an enemy deploying Panthers as standard tanks in Panzer divisions. A Sherman company with 17 tanks would possess 85 HVAP rounds total, while facing German units that might field 30 or more Panthers. The scarcity forced agonizing tactical decisions about when to use the precious ammunition and when to conserve it for more critical engagements. First contact, HVAP enters combat. The first HVAP rounds reached the European theater in August 1944, but their arrival was overshadowed by broader tactical problems plaguing American armored operations. The Normandy hedgerows had forced American armor into close-quarters combat where superior German guns could ambush Sherman columns from concealed positions. Tank crews faced an enemy who had learned to position Panthers in hull-down positions, exposing only the heavily armored turret while keeping the more vulnerable hull hidden behind terrain. German doctrine emphasized first-shot capability, with Panthers waiting in prepared positions, allowing Sherman columns to approach before opening fire from ranges where American return fire was ineffective. The psychological impact on American tank crews was severe, creating a defensive mindset that surrendered initiative even when numerical superiority should have provided advantages. The arrival of HVAP rounds began changing this calculus, but slowly. Distribution was uneven, with some units receiving significant quantities while others operated for weeks without any HVAP despite urgent requests. Training on proper HVAP employment was often minimal, as the ammunition arrived at frontline units faster than training materials and doctrine could be developed. Many crews learned effective employment techniques through trial and error under combat conditions, a costly education that sometimes resulted in wasted ammunition when rounds were fired beyond effective range or at target angles where even high-velocity armor piercing could not penetrate. Crews that fired HVAP at Panthers beyond 1,000 meters often watched the rounds bounce off, wasting scarce ammunition and often provoking return fire from German guns that remained effective at much longer ranges. But gradually, as HVAP became more widely available and crews gained experience with its capabilities, the ammunition began to demonstrate its potential. Sherman crews learned that HVAP transformed engagements that had previously been hopeless into contests where American tanks had fighting chances. Not certainty of victory, but realistic possibilities of achieving penetration if they could maneuver to favorable ranges and angles. The Battle of Arracourt, HVAP's proving ground. The first widespread combat test of HVAP ammunition came not in Normandy's hedgerows, but in the open country of Lorraine, where American armored divisions had broken out into terrain that favored German defensive tactics, but also allowed the kind of mobile operations where proper tactics and effective ammunition could overcome technical disadvantages. September of 1944 found Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army deep in France, racing toward the German border with logistics stretched to breaking points. Fuel shortages limited operations. Ammunition supplies were irregular. but Patton's aggressive advance had seized opportunities faster than German forces could react, creating a situation where American armor threatened to reach the Rhine River and potentially cross into Germany proper before winter weather halted operations. The 4th Armored Division, one of the most effective American armored formations, had advanced aggressively, seizing a bridgehead over the Moselle River near Arracourt, a small town in Lorraine. The position threatened German defensive lines and potentially opened routes toward key industrial areas. German High Command recognized the threat immediately. If Patton's armor reached the Rhine and crossed into Germany, the industrial heart of the Reich would be exposed to Allied armies, while Germany was still reeling from the Normandy defeat and Soviet offensives in the east. Stopping Patton's advance became an urgent strategic priority. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army received orders to counterattack, destroy the American bridgehead at Arracourt, and push back Patton's advance. The German force assembled for this attack included 2 newly formed Panzer brigades. The 111th and 113th, equipped primarily with Panther tanks fresh from German factories. On paper, the German advantage appeared overwhelming. The 2 brigades together fielded approximately 150 tanks against Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, which possessed roughly 50 Sherman tanks. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns in both battalions combined, including 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer Arhers. German planners anticipated a rapid victory. The Panther's technical superiority, its powerful gun, superior armor protection, and better optics should compensate for any American advantages in logistics or air support. Every tactical engagement between Panthers and Shermans in Normandy had demonstrated German superiority. There was no reason to expect different results in Lorraine. They were fundamentally, catastrophically mistaken. The Battle of Arracourt, fought over 11 days from September 18th to 29th, would become the largest tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. More importantly, it would demonstrate conclusively that American tank crews, properly trained, tactically competent, and equipped with HVAP ammunition, could defeat technically superior German armor through superior combined arms coordination, better logistics, and judicious use of specialized ammunition. The morning of September 19th began with thick fog blanketing the rolling terrain around Arracourt, weather that would prove critical to the battle's outcome. German reconnaissance was severely limited. The Panzer brigades, lacking proper scouting units and relying on incomplete intelligence, advanced blindly into terrain held by American forces who knew the ground intimately and had established defensive positions during the previous days. At approximately 8 a.m., elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated American outposts east and south of Arracourt. The German tanks, factory-new Panthers with inexperienced crews, moved forward in column formation, a tactical error that veteran American tankers immediately recognized and exploited. Captain William Dwight's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, held positions along key approaches to Arracourt. His Sherman crews had been briefed on the HVAP rounds in their ammunition racks, 6 rounds per tank, precious and irreplaceable. The briefing had emphasized, use them wisely against Panther turrets or mantlets at ranges where velocity remains sufficient for penetration. Don't waste them on targets that standard ammunition could handle. Don't fire beyond effective range. The fog that hindered German reconnaissance now worked decisively in favor of American defenders. A section of Dwight's Shermans occupied positions south of the village when the first Panther materialized from the mist, barely 75 meters away, point-blank range, where the Panther's superior long-range gunnery meant nothing, and where the Sherman's advantages in crew training and faster turret traverse could be decisive. At this range, there was no time for careful aiming or tactical maneuvering. The American gunner fired instantly, muscle memory and training taking over. The HVAP round, traveling at over 1,000 meters per second, struck the Panther's gun mantlet with devastating effect. The tungsten carbide core punched through the curved cast steel and detonated the ammunition stored directly beneath the gun breech. The Panther exploded, its turret lifting slightly from the force of the secondary detonation before the entire vehicle was consumed in flames. 2 more Panthers emerged from the fog in quick succession, following their destroyed comrade into the kill zone. Both were destroyed within seconds by HVAP rounds striking vulnerable points at close range, their crews having no time to effectively return fire in the limited visibility. The remaining German tanks in the column turned away, their commanders shocked by the sudden loss of 3 Panthers to what they had been told were inferior American tanks incapable of penetrating Panther armor frontally. Throughout the morning of September 19th, similar engagements erupted across the Arracourt sector. American tanks, using the fog as concealment and their superior knowledge of the terrain as tactical advantage, engaged Panthers at ranges where HVAP rounds were most effective. The German tactical deployment proved disastrous for reasons that transcended ammunition types. Advancing in column without proper reconnaissance, Panther crews repeatedly exposed their thinner side armor to American flanking fire. Even standard ammunition could penetrate Panther side armor at combat ranges, making the German tactical errors fatal. Near Arracourt's command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, also equipped with 76mm guns and small quantities of HVAP ammunition, engaged German armor at close range. The fast-moving tank destroyers, with their excellent mobility and powerful guns, proved devastatingly effective in the close-range, fog-shrouded combat. Their thin armor, a liability in stand-up fights, mattered less when fog prevented long-range engagements and mobility allowed them to engage, fire, and relocate before German crews could respond effectively. By noon, as the fog lifted and visibility improved, American forward artillery observers could coordinate fire with defending tank companies. Artillery fire, called with precision by experienced forward observers, struck German armor concentrations, disrupting formations and forcing Panthers to maneuver, exposing flanks and creating opportunities for American tank crews to engage from advantageous positions. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 405th Fighter Group arrived overhead in the afternoon, diving through gaps in the clouds to strike German armor with rockets and bombs. The fighter bombers couldn't reliably destroy Panthers with their ordnance. Tank armor was remarkably resistant to air attack, but they could force German tanks to button up and maneuver defensively, disrupting coordination and creating chaos that American ground forces could exploit. The combination of American advantages became overwhelming. While the Panther possessed superior armor and firepower as an individual weapon system, American forces employed combined arms tactics as standard doctrine, integrating armor with artillery, air power, infantry, and tank destroyers in a coordinated system that overwhelmed German technical advantages through superior operational execution. When Panthers encountered these prepared defenses, they were destroyed piecemeal despite their superior individual capabilities. The HVAP ammunition didn't make Sherman tanks equal to Panthers in technical specifications, but it gave Sherman crews realistic chances of achieving penetrations under favorable circumstances. Combined with superior tactics, better crew training, and overwhelming support from other arms, this was sufficient to achieve decisive tactical victories. The tactical reality, HVAP's capabilities and limitations. The HVAP ammunition did not make Sherman tanks invulnerable or give them automatic superiority over Panthers. Understanding both its capabilities and limitations is essential for assessing its true impact on armored combat in 1944 to 1945. Against the Panther's gun mantlet at ranges up to 1,000 meters, HVAP was highly effective when hits were achieved. The tungsten carbide core reliably penetrated the curved cast steel, often causing catastrophic secondary explosions as the penetrating round detonated ready ammunition stored near the breech. German crews learned quickly that mantlet hits from HVAP-equipped Shermans were frequently fatal. Against the glacis plate, the Panther's most heavily protected frontal surface, results were poor except at very close ranges and favorable angles. The extreme slope, 55 degrees from vertical, meant that tungsten carbide rounds traveling at high velocity often ricocheted or shattered on impact, the brittle tungsten core fragmenting against sloped armor rather than penetrating. This meant Sherman crews still needed to maneuver for advantageous shot angles when possible, flanking Panthers whenever tactically feasible. The effective range against Panther mantlets was approximately 1,000 meters under ideal conditions. Beyond this distance, several factors reduced effectiveness. Velocity had decreased enough that the tungsten-core might shatter on impact rather than penetrating. Accuracy decreased with range, making precise hits on the relatively small mantlet target more difficult, and the Panther's own gun remained lethally effective at ranges far beyond 1,000 meters, meaning long-range engagements still favored German tanks. Training on proper HVAP employment was inconsistent and often inadequate. Many crews learned effective techniques through combat experience rather than formal instruction, sometimes wasting precious rounds through trial and error. The scarcity of ammunition meant that practice firing was impossible. Crews went into combat with HVAP rounds they had never actually fired, learning employment techniques under life-or-death conditions. Sergeant Francis Baker's documented experience on November 20th, 1944, illustrated both the potential and limitations of HVAP in actual combat conditions. His Sherman, equipped with a 76 millimeter gun and carrying HVAP rounds, engaged a Panther at approximately 800 yards. Baker's gunner fired at least 7 rounds, achieving multiple hits observed on the Panther's side armor. To Baker's frustration, the rounds bounced off without achieving penetration. The combination of range, impact angle, and possibly defective ammunition meant that even HVAP failed to penetrate under those specific circumstances. The Panther withdrew from the engagement rather than continuing the fight, so the action was not a complete tactical failure. But it demonstrated that HVAP was not magical ammunition that guaranteed penetration under all circumstances. Proper tactics, careful shot placement, favorable range estimation, and advantageous angles of engagement remain critical factors determining success or failure. The strategic impact, changing the mathematics of armored warfare. The Battle of Arracourt's final tally told a story that transcended individual engagements. American forces had destroyed or disabled approximately 86 German tanks and assault guns, while suffering losses of 25 Sherman tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The kill ratio heavily favored the Americans despite their technical disadvantage in individual tank performance. This outcome demonstrated that armored warfare outcomes depended on far more than individual tank capabilities. The integration of armor with artillery, air power, infantry support, and superior logistics proved more decisive than the technical specifications of individual tanks. German Panthers, operating without adequate support and led by inexperienced crews following flawed tactics, were defeated by American forces that might have been individually outmatched but were collectively superior. The HVAP ammunition's role in this victory was significant but not sole determining factor. It gave Sherman crews realistic chances of penetrating Panther armor under favorable circumstances, reducing the psychological advantage German armor had enjoyed. But the victory resulted from combined effects of better tactics, superior crew training, overwhelm, Ming logistics, complete air superiority, and more effective integration of combined arms. For American tankers, the most important impact was psychological. The ammunition demonstrated that Panthers were not invulnerable, that American tanks could engage them successfully under proper circumstances. This knowledge transformed crew behavior, making them more willing to engage German armor rather than reflexively calling for support or retreating. For German tankers, HVAP's introduction had equally important psychological effects. Panther crews who had relied on their armor's invulnerability found that American tanks could now penetrate their mantlets at combat ranges. The sense of security that thick frontal armor provided, critical to crew morale and aggressive tactics, eroded as crews learned their protection was no longer absolute. The production race and allocation challenges. As HVAP production increased through late 1944 and early 1945, allocation decisions became increasingly complex and contentious. Tank destroyers, whose mission focused specifically on anti-tank combat, received preferential allocation. This made tactical sense. Tank destroyers existed primarily to kill enemy tanks, so equipping them with the most effective anti-tank ammunition was logical. But Sherman tanks, with their dual role of supporting infantry and engaging enemy armor, often received fewer HVAP rounds despite encountering enemy tanks more frequently than tank destroyers. This created operational tension between tactical needs and supply realities that was never fully resolved. The allocation system, managed at multiple command levels from Army down to battalion, resulted in inefficiencies and inequities. Some units received more HVAP than they could immediately use, the ammunition sitting in reserve, while other units exhausted their supply within days of heavy combat and received no resupply despite urgent requests. When German forces launched their surprise Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, American tank units faced renewed intense pressure from hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks deployed in the initial assault. Sherman crews relied heavily on their scarce HVAP ammunition to engage German heavy armor, but the shortage became critical within days of heavy fighting. Some units exhausted their HVAP supply completely by December 20th and found resupply requests going unfulfilled as logistical networks struggled to deliver ammunition through snow-blocked roads disrupted by German advances. Tank crews reverted to standard ammunition and pre-HVAP tactics, flanking maneuvers, close-range engagements targeting mantlets and side armor, and heavy reliance on tank destroyers and artillery support. Yet even in the difficult fighting of the Ardennes, American forces demonstrated that tactical skill and combined arms coordination could compensate for technical disadvantage. Sherman crews coordinated closely with infantry, using bazooka teams to disable Panthers from close range, while tanks provided covering fire. Artillery forward observers called in devastating concentrations that damaged optics, disabled tracks, and killed exposed crew members even when shells could not penetrate armor. Air support, when weather finally permitted in late December and January, proved catastrophically effective against German armor concentrated on approach roads. The Battle of the Bulge ended with German armored forces shattered, having lost hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and experienced crews in an offensive that failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The defeat resulted not from any single American advantage, but from the cumulative weight of superior logistics, better trained infantry, overwhelming artillery, dominant air power, and armored forces that, even when individually outmatched, fought effectively through superior tactics and combined arms integration. The post-war assessment and lessons learned. The post-war analysis of HVAP ammunition revealed both its successes and limitations with the clarity that only hindsight and systematic study can provide. Against the Panther's gun mantlet at ranges up to 1,000 meters, HVAP proved highly effective when hits were achieved, reliably penetrating and often causing catastrophic internal damage through secondary ammunition detonations. Against the Glacis plate, results remained poor, except at very close ranges and near perpendicular impact angles. The extreme slope of Panther frontal armor meant that even tungsten carbide penetrators traveling at high velocity frequently ricocheted or shattered rather than penetrating, confirming that armor slope remained an effective defense even against specialized ammunition. The ammunition's scarcity throughout the European campaign meant its strategic impact was less than its tactical potential suggested. If every 76mm Sherman had been equipped with adequate HVAP supplies from July 1944 onward, American tank casualties might have been significantly lower and German Panther losses correspondingly higher. But the tungsten scarcity that limited production was unavoidable given competing industrial demands and limited global supplies. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided another combat test of HVAP effectiveness under different circumstances. American Sherman tanks, primarily the M4A3E8 variant armed with 76mm guns, faced Soviet-built T-34/85 tanks in North Korean and later Chinese service. Unlike the desperate scarcity of World War II, by 1950, tungsten supplies were no longer constrained by competing wartime demands, and substantial HVAP stocks were available. American tank crews in Korea found that HVAP rounds easily penetrated T-34/85 armor at normal combat ranges. The T-34/85, while a capable tank, possessed armor protection significantly inferior to the Panther. Its 90 millimeter thick turret front and 45 millimeter thick glacis plate could not resist tungsten carbide projectiles fired at high velocity from 76 millimeter guns at combat ranges. American Shermans in Korea achieved remarkably favorable exchange ratios against communist armor, partly due to superior crew training, and partly to the plentiful availability of HVAP ammunition that had been so scarce in Europe. The vindication of the 76 millimeter Sherman in Korea was bittersweet for veterans of European combat who had fought Panthers with inadequate ammunition supplies, knowing that the rounds that would have saved lives in 1944 had finally become available years too late.